Bienvenidos to our first LHC membership webinars program of 2025. It's amazing to think that we hosted our first membership webinar program in December of 2023, and we are excited to continue providing a space for important conversations on Latinx heritage conservation. My name is Jen Moran, and I'm here to help on the back end with Zoom, anybody logging in. Today's presentation features Wes Singletary, PhD, author and historian, and Jen Moran from our very own Latinos and Heritage Conservation. And today the title of our presentation will be Beyond the Bases, Latinx Heritage in Baseball's History. I'll let somebody in. Come on in. So thank you all again for joining for our very first webinar of 2025. Be sure to mark your calendars because upcoming, our next one will be June 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time. Our panelists, Dr. Jeremy C. Wells and Hector J. Verdesia Hernandez, will be presenting on reforming architectural conservation, una plática. So for all of those who really like architectural conservation and everything around that, mark your calendars for this. It's going to be a great one. And finally, LHC members receive live access to webinars where they can ask our presenters questions directly, as well as they get early recording access. So this presentation is being recorded, and for our members, you'll be getting an email with a link so you can see this, even if you didn't make it or if you only saw part of this presentation. And for the public, the recording of this presentation will be posted on our website a week from today. Be sure to visit our website to see all of our past recordings of our wonderful webinars. And for those who are watching, maybe are not members, maybe watching the recording, please consider membership with LHC. We have brand new membership levels in 2025, which include yearly and monthly payment plans, and they have all types of benefits. Not only do you get to see these webinars live, early recordings, we're also going to be unveiling a new forum soon. You get discounts on Congreso registration, and many, many more. These are some of our membership levels, and we also unveiled this year a new community supporter membership. So for anybody who maybe has a good connection with corporations or foundations, other groups who would want to come and join and support LHC and all the wonderful work that we do, feel free to share the information, spread the word. And of course, for those, we encourage everybody to consider membership to help LHC continue this work. And with that, I will stop sharing screen and pass it over to our host and moderator today, Patricia Zarate Singletary. Take it away.
Okay, hello everybody. As Renee said, my name is Patricia Zarate Singletary. I started at Latinos and Heritage Conservation in September as the grants manager. I was brought on to launch and manage LHC's grant program, which is the first ever grant program dedicated to funding Latinx preservation of historic sites relevant to Latinx history in this country. So it's been very exciting. The applications are due this Saturday, February 15th. But if this is your first time hearing about it and you're interested in applying, we will have the applications open again for the next 2 years at least. There will be more opportunities for funding. You don't have to fill out an application in 3 days. So just be aware of that, but feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the website if you want to know more about grants. I'm here today to moderate this wonderful discussion between Dr. Singletary and our very own Jen Moran. So to disclose, Dr. Singletary is my father. I told the staff at LHC that we had a lot of good information coming from him on Latinos in baseball and that relevance in history. I was actually a public programs intern at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York in 2018. And I learned a lot more about baseball from that than I ever thought I would know. I mainly went because it was a paid museum internship. They always said there, you're here at the hall either because you love baseball or you love someone who loves baseball. I fell into the latter. So with that, let me introduce my dad, Dr. Singletary. Wes is the author of Al Lopez, The Life of Baseball's El Señor, which was published in 1999, The Right Time, John Henry, Pop Lloyd in Black Baseball, and Florida's First Big League Baseball Players, A Narrative History. He is also a contributing author of The Pride of Smoketown, The Pittsburgh Crawfords, and he has a PhD in American history from Florida State University and continues to teach in Tallahassee at Lawton Chiles High School and at Tallahassee State College, formerly Tallahassee Community College. Dr. Singletary is of Cuban descent, and he is a proud native of West Tampa, one of Tampa's two historic Latin quarters. He also has, until recently, coached the consecutive six-time state American Legion baseball champions, Tallahassee Post 13. So to start off, Dr. Singletary, if you could please give us some information about how baseball has evolved in this country, specifically in relation to Latino history.
Yeah, first of all, Mijita, thank you very much for having me on y'all's program. I very much enjoy any opportunity to talk about baseball, but you can't talk about baseball without talking about Hispanics in baseball, especially when you come from where I come from in Florida. Uh, Baseball would not have evolved in the Sunshine State were it not for Latinos like the Cuban cigar workers in Tampa, or even the Spanish and later the Puerto Ricans and Dominicans who came through Tampa looking in the cigar trade that were there. But it wasn't just Tampa; it was Key West. If you look at Florida right now, for instance, we're the third largest state in the country now. Wasn't always that way, obviously. When I was a boy, it was a backwater. It wasn't that big. You go back to like the 1950s. I think Florida maybe had 25 guys born in the state that had made it to the major leagues. And of them, a handful of them were from Tampa, and they were all Latin. Okay, guys like Al Lopez and Charlie Cuellar, Manuel Onís, and they all emerged out of these Latin enclaves, like where I came from in West Tampa, or Ybor City, and their parents were all immigrants who had come through Cuba, many from Spain to Cuba for the cigar industry, and then they would, usually over labor strife, the Spanish cigar factories would leave Cuba and go on to Key West, and then on to to Ybor City, where they established this community. You had the Board of Trade there, gave them the land in exchange for bringing the cigar factories to Tampa, and over 200 ultimately, over 200 cigar factories were there, and the workers, found in baseball something that they could, bring with them that tied them back to their home country, because a lot of people thought, baseball is America's game, and while it was developing in the country after the Civil War, it had not developed to the extent that it would naturally come as it did from Cuba. Cuba, it was becoming the Cuban game. If you get really to around the turn of the century, after the war for Cuba Libre, the war with Jose Marti and Antonio Maceo, Cubans turned away from Spanish bullfighting and a lot of things that the Spaniards have been involved in, and they focused heavily on baseball. I mean, baseball is very much the Cuban game as much as it is the American game. And the Cuban players, these cigar workers, they brought it with them, and it very much became a hot topic in Tampa and branched out from there because of it. Now, you can go back in Major League Baseball and look at the very first Latino players to arrive in Major League Baseball. Of course, they were white because of the Jim Crow segregation that took place in Major League Baseball from the turn of the last century. The first players, Armando Marsans, and oh, good grief, I went over this earlier, but Armando Marsans, Rafael Almeida, they came from Cuba, and they were Anglo-Cubans. Adolfo Luque, one of my favorite players from that era. They call him the Havana Perfecto. Okay, but again, lights, not necessarily white, but kind of Caucasian, about like myself, maybe a little bit more what you would consider stereotypical Latin features, but they didn't have the dark complexion that other people might have, and so they kind of got over with it. Even then, they took a great deal of abuse. I mean, Al Lopez, the Hall of Fame manager from Tampa, who wasn't Cuban. Al Lopez's parents came from Spain to Cuba, evolved to Ybor City, where Al was born. Al took a lot of abuse coming through, where they would call him Cuban this or Cuban that, and he would say, "I'm not even Cuban, I'm Spanish." But these were pioneers in that first wave of Latin American ball players to make it to the major leagues. But for every Latin American baseball player that ultimately made it to the majors, there were better ball players that weren't making it because they were Afro Cubans, Afro Puerto Ricans, Afro Dominicans. I mean, some of the greats, like Jose Mendez, the Black Diamond, they referred to him. White ball players knew who these guys were, because white American ball players, they didn't get paid back then what they get now. All right. So they would go to Cuba and play during the winter, and they had to face these guys during the winter. So you had you had the Major League Baseball, at the same time you had the Negro Leagues, which is kind of like my major area of research now. And you know, you would see a guy like Al Lopez from Tampa, and he would play against the older Pop Lloyd from Palaca in Cuba, where they would never play in the United States. And, you know, it was just odd that way. But you get in Cuba, and you had Jose Mendez, okay? You would have Cristobal Torriente, you would have Alejandro Oms, you'd have Martin de Higo, okay? Martin de Higo is like in 5 different Hall of Fames from different countries. He may be the greatest baseball player who's ever lived, okay? El Maestro, El Inmortal, that's what they call Martin de Higo. He was that good. He was a pitcher and a baseball player. Okay, he was every bit Babe Ruth. I mean, he was that kind of player. But they didn't make it to the major leagues because of their skin tone. So Latin American baseball players were there, and they were there at the onset of baseball. Okay, but you know, they didn't play the high profile Major League Baseball because of the segregation, the Jim Crow segregation. But that doesn't mean they didn't play it. And some of the very best played in the Negro Leagues. They played in Mexico. They played in the leagues in the winter leagues. It was a circuit. And I've talked to a number of guys who didn't necessarily play way back. Let me get back up some. There were some guys at the tail end of the Negro Leagues that played in the 50s and so forth. And I've talked to some of them who would talk to the older guys. And what they would tell me is that by virtue of playing in the Caribbean during the winter, then they go out west, okay? Then they would play with their regular team. By playing all year round, they could make in a year what a comparable major league salary was, because the major leaguers weren't making as much, and most major leaguers would play their season and then go home and have to get a job somewhere. So, you know, it wasn't a horrible life. It was in terrible conditions for the most part when you consider it, you know, playing for the Yankees or somewhere. But you know, they did what they had to do. But, you know, you can't say baseball in the United States without Latin Americans, because Latin Americans were at the beginning. Latin American Latinos were at the beginning. They played it all over this country. They were just as good, if not better, than anybody. And the fact that some still very good, especially Afro Latinos, are still not in the Hall of Fame is still something that's overlooked and needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Now, I know you brought some photos. Do you want to dive into those?
Well, I just, you know, yeah, go ahead and put them up, because I think it just gives you a different idea of some of the stuff that I was just talking about.
Absolutely.
If you
Hold
can put 'em
one
up.
second.
You know, I tend to go on pretty fast too. So, you know, anytime y'all want to interject, but you know, again, I'm just trying to paint the picture here. You know, you've got Major League Baseball, you've got baseball in general, but in places like these 2 pictures here, on the left, you've got a picture of Ybor City. On the right, it's this old cigar factory in West Tampa. These are the 2 Latin enclaves in Tampa, and communities like this around the country, whether it was in Southern California, whether it was in Texas, okay, whether it was in Key West, whether it was in places like New Jersey, they were hotbeds for baseball, because baseball is at the heart of Latin American communities, okay, of Latino communities. Okay, it's a Latino game. It's at the heart of Latino communities, and has been for, you know, the last 150 years. And I can tell you from experience growing up in this particular community that it very much is that. Baseball is the game. People think to themselves now about Tampa, and I keep bringing it up, but that's my experience. Oh, Tampa, that's not a baseball team. No, nobody even goes to Rays games. That's because the little leagues are packed. Okay, you go to Tampa any given night that the Rays are playing, I could take you to any little league where I came from, and those places are packed with fans just screaming for those kids. It's amazing down there. And you look at the number of big leaguers, major leaguers who have come out of those areas. You know, you look at 2001 in the World Series, you had Tino Martinez playing first base for the Yankees and Luis Gonzalez playing second base for the Diamondbacks, competing against each other. They played first and second base for Jefferson High School in Tampa. Okay, in 1990, you had Lou Piniella managing the Reds against Tony La Russa managing the A's. They played Jefferson and Jesuit High School in Tampa. Okay, I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of baseball talent that comes out of these communities. And I'm going to tell you, 80% of is Latin. I mean, at Tampa, we all refer to it as Latin, because nobody anymore, where I come from, is Cuban or Spanish. You're all like part Cuban, part Spanish, part Italian, part Cuban, part Mexican, you know, and we're Americans. Okay, but that Latino background is strong. The heritage is there, and baseball is at the heart of that Latino communities. This is a picture. It dates from the 1920s. And it's in West Tampa. It's where McFarland Park is now. And you can still see over here off to the left in the pictures a hill. That hill, I swear to you, every little birthday party ever was on that hill. But this was the type of baseball that was being played at that time. You had something called like an intersocial league. And it was a semi-professional league that some very good baseball players came through either on their way to professional baseball or on their way back. And it's just an excellent caption of what was really taking place here. I'm looking at some of the questions over here too. Robert Arsola asked if there are any historic structures, stadiums, ball fields, or parks, residents associated with Latino baseball players. And yeah, of course, you know, they're around. You know, in Tampa, you've got Al Lopez Park. Al Lopez had a field. There was a baseball stadium. There might be a picture on here, one of these pictures, but there's Al Lopez Field was a stadium, and don't worry about that for now. You'll find them. We'll get to that in a minute. But Al Lopez Field was a stadium that Al outlived it. They ended up, there it is on the right. Al actually outlived that stadium. He used to laugh about that. It was there forever. When I was a kid, we used to go there a lot and watch the Class A Tampa Tarpons, which was in the Cincinnati Reds organization, play baseball. But they built that stadium after Al led the Cleveland Indians to the World Series in 1954. Al Lopez was led the only two teams in 16 years to beat the New York Yankees for the American League pennant, with Cleveland in 54 and with the Chicago White Sox in 59. On the left is another baseball park that I grew up in, Wellswood. Yeah, Wellswood and West Tampa were two competing little leagues, and they were both inside of what you call West Tampa. And they're, again, heavily Latino ballparks. If you look at teams that I played on, I showed somebody a picture the other day. It was like 14 guys. Every single name on that team, except for Singletary, was a Latin name. But even me, I got the Cuban background, so it was interesting. But you can go through these pictures. I can explain what we're looking at here. Over here on the left side is a guy I already mentioned him, Adolfo Luque. He's the older one, the Havana Perfecto. Luque has an interesting background. He was an incredible pitcher with the big leagues, but he was hard. He was mean. He would come after you. He would battle. An intense competitor, would throw at you in a minute to get you off the plate. And he taught his pitchers, as a coach, he taught his pitchers to do the same thing. Down in Mexico, when he managed down there, he had a pitcher in the Federal League named Sal Magli, who he taught very much to come inside and be that aggressive pitcher. So much so they called Sal Magli the barber. And Sal Magli pitched for the Dodgers in the World Series. And then Sal Magli mentored Don Drysdale. And Don Drysdale, one of the great inside pitchers of the 1960s. So you see how the tradition continues. But this is Charlie Cuellar of Tampa, who's with Luque, and they're with Almendares down in Cuba in the winter leagues. Over here on the right, that's just a picture. That's typical Tampa. That's a picture I took maybe 6 months ago. I like to call that picture the last breakfast because of the way everybody's turning in different angles. But if you see the guy on the left-hand side here, that's Lenny Faedo. He with a hat. He's looking up at the guy that says Godson. Lenny played in the big leagues. He was the starting shortstop for the Minnesota Twins when he was about 19. And there's 3 other guys in that picture that all play professional baseball. And it's in West Tampa. Everybody's, Latin or Italian. Ronnie DeRigo there in the middle is Italian. But many, it's just, again, everybody there is Spanish, Latin, Cuban, and so forth. And it's just an incredible tradition that they have there in that community. So what other pictures do you have here? Oh, this is interesting. This is a 1924 Tampa Smokers. And if you see the guy right in the middle, where did he go? He's got the sweater on there, right off to the left. There you go. That's Cesar Alvarez. Cesar Alvarez was Cuban. He was from Cuba, and he married a local Cuban girl. So he probably could have pitched in a lot of other different higher classification minor leagues. But the Smokers paid him a lot of money to stay there in Tampa, because the Tampa Smokers, the Florida State League in 1924, they drew big crowds with the cigar workers. The cigar workers were all paid on peacetime, so which meant that you got paid based on how many cigars you rolled a day, and then they would come out to the games that were played, 2:30. And Cesar Alvarez was very popular there. And the next year, Al Lopez, who came up as a young kid, he was signed when he was 16 years old, was on the team, and Cesar Alvarez was very much a mentor to the young Al Lopez, who went on to become the Hall of Famer. And this is Al Lopez. This was probably, let's see, Al, number 7. He's playing with the Boston Braves. So it's 4 or 5 years into his major league career. This is when Al's in high school. It's an interesting picture. I'm pointing to the camera like y'all can see my finger. I don't know if you know that. Al is third from right in the back row. This is Sacred Heart High School. Today it's Jesuit High School, one of the winningest high school teams in the history of the state. And virtually, all the players on this team are Latino. But I looked at this picture one time and I said, Al, I said, who are these guys in the background? They kind of look older than y'all. These 2 guys with the dark hats next to him. And Al said, oh, yeah, that's Sam Rice and Joe Judge. Al was such a good catcher that the Washington Senators, who had just won the World Series in 24 and lost in the World Series in 25, were coming to Tampa during spring training, and they needed extra catchers because those guys hit by the hour back then, and Al would come out and catch for them. So they would come out and work with Sacred Heart. Plus, they were getting in training and practice for spring training. So right there next to Al Lopez is the Hall of Famer Sam Rice, and next to him is the other big leaguer Joe Judge. But that's something that always happens in Tampa. There's so many ball players down there. They're always mixing it up with the local kids, and you just see so much of it. And it's a hell of an experience, frankly. I remember when I was a kid. Now, these are all professional ball players from Tampa. The top picture is Charlie Cuellar. Won over 200 games in the minor leagues, kind of hurt his arm, and by the time he got to the big leagues, that's what held him back. The guy on the bottom right is Manuel Onís. Okay, had an interesting story. He was a good catcher, solid. Went up to the 35 Brooklyn Dodgers. He was a catcher with Al Lopez on that team. And but he was sent down. It was in the middle of the Depression. They sent him down on a 10-day recall. And while he was down in the minors, he got into it with an umpire. He told the umpire, you made a bad call. The ump said, I'm going to throw you out. And Onís was a hothead, and he turned around and told the umpire, I'm going to smack you. So long story short, he beat the mess out of the umpire, and it cost him. He bounced around the minors after that, but he never made it back to the big leagues. Ended up retiring in Tampa with the fire department. So he said, yeah, opportunity. I had one and I blew it. But he was an incredibly funny guy. And the other picture is Al Lopez out in front of his home. And I took that picture around 1992. And if you see that house, modest ranch style home, but if you go into the home, you go out the back door, there's Tampa Bay. And so when he passed away, the house was destroyed, and they built a mansion there, of course.
But speaking to that, so since we're about to conclude your time, Dr. Singletary, I want to talk a little bit about, so also just there again, speaking of Little League, got to show this photo real fast.
Yeah,
but are you in these?
Bottom all the way over here, bottom left on the picture on the left.
Number 5?
Yeah.
Or 15? Nice.
Five. So,
but
here's
the thing.
5. On this team, these 2 teams here, you have, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 12, 13 guys that played college or professional baseball. Okay, so
That's
I mean, and that was just an incredible rivalry there. And that was a picture of Al Lopez with the kids. They're just all, that's Lou Piniella. I don't know, many of y'all maybe have heard of Sweet Lou, the major league manager. He's lost a lot of weight now, but he's still down there in Tampa kicking. And I took that picture of Lou not too long ago. But Lou is Italian and Spanish, so it's a very common thing.
Yeah. I want to get to talk about Al Lopez's house and the museum that was made. So since we're a preservation-based organization, can you talk a little bit about the museum? And then after that, just give any final concluding thoughts.
Sure. I had the fortune of being on the board of the museum for a number of years. And they, the way we got this house was Al lived in this house, I want to say from the time he was a kid up until about 1963. Not just Al, but his extended family. And the house was not very big, but he would come home from the major leagues either as a player or as a manager, and he would live there all winter long. And it was over on 12th Street in Ybor City. And then it was probably about 10 years ago or so, we had it moved over to 8th Street in Ybor City, and then was able to restore it. And now it is the #1 artifact in the Tampa Baseball Museum. It's it's not the Tampa Bay Baseball Museum. It focuses on Tampa, but if you go in there, you'll see like a autographed baseball signed by every kid ever came out of Tampa, made it to the big leagues. And I'll tell you again, 80% of those are probably Latin ball players, and they just do a great job with it. But to have the house that Al Lopez was raised in serve as the headquarters, of the museum
It was
itself.
moved, right? It had to be moved, didn't
Yeah,
it?
we moved it
Yeah.
it was moved from 12th Street, and the house right next to it was moved as well. They were both moved from 12th Street, which is probably 4 or 5 blocks away on the other side of the interstate. Because the interstate cut through I-4 during urban renewal in the 60s. And it really ruined Ybor City for a long time, cut it in half. But it was moved. It was right up against the interstate, and it was moved from 12th Street over to 8th, and they've done a wonderful job with it. It's a great museum, and I always talk it up when I'm down there, and I'm always down there helping out whenever I can. So
awesome. Do you have any final thoughts to share with us before we get to our
just to tie it back to where we started.
Mhm.
Baseball, again, it's been said, it's the pastime, the national pastime. I still firmly believe it is. I think it's like Walt Whitman said, it's as important to the institutions in this country as many things are. But without Latinos, without the influence of Latins and the love for the game that Latin Americans now Latinos have always possessed, it would not be what it is. Latino ball players made the game what it is today, and I firmly believe that, and I continue to research and work on it, and I enjoy it very much.
And I just put this up here to publicize
Yeah,
his books a little
Al
bit.
Lopez and me.
He wrote them. He wrote them. You can get them.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much, Dr. Singletary. I'm sure you can all see why I have come to work for an org like Latinos in Heritage Conservation. Being raised by a PhD in history definitely influenced my career trajectory, and I'm very passionate about similar subjects and not as much about baseball, but always love hearing him talk about it. So now we get
I
to
tried to
hear
get you to play. That's not on me.
we try. I'm no athlete. But yeah, so all right. Well, if you can mute yourself, Dr. Singletary, we're now going to talk to our very own Jen Moran. So Jennifer Moran is a Chicana feminist PhD candidate with the Washington State University Department of History. She has presented work at the National Council on Public History in 2018, discussing education and the archives. Her public writing can be found on the Spokane Historical website, the WSU History Department's Digging Up the Past, and Chicana Latina Studies, the Journal of Mujeres Activas en Luchas y Cambio Social. Her research is rooted in and builds upon legacies of Chicana feminism. Her current work focuses on Chicana reproductive justice activism in the 20th century. She is now our wonderful education coordinator and continues her work as an activist scholar focused on promoting, preserving, and educating for the Latinx community. All right, Jen, please take it away with your wonderful baseball information.
Yes. Hi, everyone. As she said, my name is Jen Moran. I am actually going to talk about what was my first dissertation idea. It turns out this is very niche. This presentation is about Mexican American women in baseball around the 30s and 40s, so a league of their own. There were Latina baseball players. There were a lot of Cuban ones, which I wanted to get into that, but I specifically in my research when I was doing this decided I was going to focus just on women of Mexican origin, whether they be Mexican American or women who had immigrated. And so that's my focus, and I have a little presentation to go with it, and some pictures that I found in the archive are also in there. So I will share my screen, and I did not put it in presentation mode. Just a second. There we go. Okay. So, this is not the view I wanted. I'm sorry. Let me go. No, this was not. Sorry.
No presenter view.
No presenter view. Yeah, we're not gonna do that. Okay. So, this is the title of Mexican American Women in Baseball and Softball. And I talk about the barriers that they broke and how they had to redefine gender roles as they were doing this. So they not only had to fight and deal with racism and colorism, they also had to deal with the things that were expected of them as women, especially women in a Mexican household. So that's kind of what I talk about here. So thank you for being here. I'm going to explore the remarkable history of these women. Their story is one of resilience. They broke barriers and they redefined gender roles in both the sport and society. So we're going to begin with this journey back in World War II. So during World War II, as is pretty common knowledge, the absence of men in the workforce created a lot of new opportunities for women. They began to come outside of the household, get jobs that they weren't working at home, caring for kids, caring for the house. They began to work outside of their home in many different kinds of jobs, manufacturers, outside of being secretaries, like they weren't secretaries anymore, they were manufacturers. They worked in train yards. They took all of the jobs that the men who were away weren't able to do. Stepping into these roles proved that they had capabilities beyond domestic work. The shift not only brought them financial independence, but also expanded their social circles. And many of them, these new social circles led to the world of recreational sports. These sports were popular already. Baseball was already being played. Factories had teams. If you worked in a brickyard, that brickyard probably had a team. So they were just taking over these roles and playing in these sports that were already there, but they just needed someone else to play. And the funny thing is that Mexican American women who took on these fabrication jobs were actually referred to as Rosita, the Riveter, instead of Rosie, which I thought was really funny because I'd never heard of that when I was doing my research. These sports, they became an avenue for recreation and camaraderie. Softball, which is what they began with, was considered the more alternative view to feminine view, alternative view to baseball, and it was very popular. At this time too, the sport that women mostly played were like tennis. They didn't play anything where they were going to get dirty, really. They had to look cute. The whole you needed to fulfill that heteronormative woman role, and that's what you had to do. And so they started with softball first. Many Mexican American women embraced the sport. They formed teams, as I said before, that were supported by local businesses. And in these teams, they weren't just about the game. It was about community. It was about making friends. It was about building connections, because many times they had the women in their family, but that was all they had because their husbands were away. And so they needed to seek outside support because, they kind of had to all support each other during this time. And they were more than just sports. They were often social and cultural events. Families would gather on the weekends. So as Dr. Singletary was saying, those little league those little league games are packed. It was like this too. This was a way to get together, a sport to watch, where they could all do it, sometimes usually for free. In Los Angeles, Sundays, that was the only day most people didn't work. Sundays was the day that you would have all of the baseball games at the local park, and everyone would get there. There would be vendors and they would sell food. And so it just became almost like the weekly event, the place to be when you wanted to do something social. There we go. While they gained some independence through work in sports, the traditional gender roles of these women still played a strong role in their lives. After the war, and when people were coming back, fathers and husbands often had the final say in whether or not women could participate in sports. Many women had to complete household duties before they could even begin to go to practice, and supervision was often required. So they would have there's an oral history that I had read of one player, and she said, well, I had to ask my dad if I could go play, and he was like, no, you have to go do the wash, you have to do all these things before you can leave, and then you have to take your brother because you need a chaperone. So that was pretty much the norm. A lot of times if they were sisters would play together. This way, if the sisters were on the same team, they only needed one chaperone because they were related. So that was really, really common to have that male oversight still in order to just be able to play. And from the oral histories I read, some did not take that lightly. So there was some kind of pushback and arguing kind of with the parents. But at the end of the day, they didn't want to argue too much because they still wanted to be allowed to play the sports. Oh, I skipped it. Sorry. Okay. So, and this goes into all of this falls into the femininity. So there is the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, which is very popularized by a league of their own. And so I believe in this movie, they do show them like getting themselves all pretty, and they have to go to charm. They had to go to charm school. It was required. So these rules, they govern their appearance and their behavior. They had to have the ultra feminine kind of image. They wore makeup and skirts, and they were not allowed to wear baseball pants. And so they really did this. The whole purpose of it was to combat the rules or the stereotypes that females were, that female athletes were masculine. So there was that like this thought that if these women played, they would be seen as more manly, and they didn't want them to be seen that way. They still wanted them to be seen as women, which I think would probably drive me crazy if I was trying to play baseball and had to look pretty at the same time. So not only did they have to deal with all of that gender issues, they also found racial discrimination within the league. So the players that were chosen to play, building off of what Wes said, they were light-skinned. They were mostly very fair, and so they were the only ones really accepted, and they had better opportunities. The best well-known was probably a Mexican-American player named Marge Villa from Los Angeles, and she was even misidentified often as Spanish to make her presence more acceptable to the white audience in newspapers. So they would call her the Spanish player instead of actually just saying that she is Mexican. And that goes back to the colorism and just the stereotypes of coming from Mexico. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Marge Villa. She was a standout player, but her identity, like I said, was overlooked. She had set a lot of records. She had incredible skill, and she had to even navigate racial discrimination and gender expectations on her own team. So in an interview, she actually mentions that her and other Latina players were told to refrain from speaking Spanish. Do not speak Spanish out on the field. Do not speak Spanish back in the locker rooms. Don't speak it. Don't speak it to the press. Yet, at the same time, when they went to places like Cuba to play or Mexico, then her skills at speaking Spanish were definitely needed, and it was okay. So it was very much like a pick and choose of what they wanted from her identity to use on the team. And so she still played, though, to the best of the ability, and she was very resilient, and her skills were amazing. She was often written about in the newspapers as like this you've got to see it kind of player, you know, those ones that just stand above the rest. So she was very, very talented. And for Mexican women baseball, it was more than just a sport. It was also an expression of their identity. They straddled two cultures, the Mexican culture and the American culture. And so the ballpark became a place where Mexican heritage and American heritage kind of coexisted. So they were playing this considered all-American sport, having picnics that were considered, you know, the all-American thing to do back then. But they were still bringing their Mexican culture and their Mexican heritage into it. So it became this kind of like melting pot in one little space every Sunday to get together and play. And so the legacy and the impact it extends beyond what the time that they played. Their participation did open doors for future generations of male athletes, especially the ones that were professional. And it contributed heavily to the struggle for gender equality in sports. Their resilience really shaped not only baseball history, but also women's sports history. And although most people think of a league of their own when they think of women in baseball, these women defied expectations and left an indelible mark on the sport, especially for the Latinx community.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was wonderful. I always love learning about women in baseball. It just warms my heart. Speaking of league of their own, I've pulled up here. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the TV show that they made actually on Amazon Prime, but the Amazon show does actually have Latina representation in the cast and in the characters. This character at the bottom left of the lineup down here is Mexican and is described as the Spanish striker, pulling directly from that story that you mentioned to represent that part of the history as well. And over here in the red hat and the yellow shorts, she is from Cuba and can only speak Spanish. And so the Mexican player has to help translate, and then that becomes frustrating, but it's a lovely show. If y'all like the movie, check out the show. It's good stuff. But it does a good job of trying to include more of those historical narratives and in a more inclusive fashion than the original film was able to do. So now we are just opening up the floor until the end of our call today, or until no one has any more questions left for just discussion. First off, though, I'm really curious, Jen and Dr. Singletary, if y'all have questions for each other. If there's anything that you heard the other one say that you want to know more about.
I don't have a question, but I did find it. I found it really neat that there was a similarity, even though yours was slightly before when mine took place. Those things still were prevalent. Those issues that they were still dealing with before World War II started were prevalent after. It kind of just never went away until the 60s. So women or men, it was the same kind of.
I think they're still kind of prevalent.
Yeah.
That's just the way things are. I mean, you can imagine, you could be in South Texas right now and have some young girl who's there with their family who happens to be working, but yet somehow, I don't know, I doubt they would have time, but somehow somebody comes upon her and sees her hitting a ball somewhere and they get her out there. You can write a story about it. Those kind of things happen. But no, I thought everything was just amazing. I really enjoyed the tie-in of League of Their Own, especially when I was in Cooperstown. There was a historian, and I can't remember her name now, but she was studying not the same angle that you had. She was looking mainly at the All-American Girls League, and this was probably, I don't know, 20 years ago. But I just found it fascinating because other than growing up playing ball with the girls that I mentioned to you earlier before we went on the air, I just never knew anything about it. It's the same kind of thing with the Negro Leagues. The Negro Leagues, I never knew anything about that. Yeah, then it's not like they teach us stuff in school. You don't know anything about it. You don't grow up knowing that there was a whole nother league back in the 20s and 30s. I mean, I wrote this book on John Henry Lloyd because one of my major professors, one of my committee professors, did a book on African Americans in Florida and had a little kind of like a caveat on him in there. And I was like, who is this? And I'm thinking to myself, I'm from Florida. I'm supposed to know baseball. I never even heard of this guy. And so the more you dig, the more offshoots you have, and the more you find out. But the fact that girls play ball the way they do now, it's just incredible because it's everywhere. And you see it everywhere. When I mentioned earlier, when I was a boy, the girls from our little league were mostly like our little sisters, and they were as good as most of the boys. And they all loaded up and they went up and they won baseball, softball games all over the country. And now they're out there playing baseball, especially at the little league level. The girls are usually some of the better players. So it's a great thing, great thing. I love
I also
it.
just put in the chat a link to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which is a great museum in Kansas City. I know Dr. Singletary has done research
Kendrick.
there before. It's a fantastic place to learn a lot of information. It doesn't hold, excuse me, the exhibit in the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum about Negro Leagues doesn't hold a candle to this museum. This museum has its own thing.
Kendrick. Yeah, I'm sorry, baby. Bob Kendrick, the executive director at the Negro Leagues Museum in Kansas City, I think is the #1 baseball man in the country. I think Major League Baseball should make him the what do they call him now? The commissioner. Nobody can get out there and get you excited about baseball like Bob Kendrick. And that museum and the expansion that they have going on now, taking the old YMCA building where the first Negro League was established, the first contracts were signed, and turning that into the Buck O'Neill Center for Education. The stuff that they're doing is amazing. It really is an incredible place to go. And again, so many of the Negro Leaguers were Latino. And so you don't just think of it as black baseball. So many of them were Afro-Cubans that it's very important to be aware of this.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. So are there any other, thinking of Tampa as a hotbed of Latino baseball in the United States, are there other hotbeds similar to Tampa throughout the country? This person in particular is doing historic property survey of Latinos in Phoenix, Arizona, and knowing if you know of any baseball connections in that region or other regions in the country.
Jen, what about you were doing Mexican American in South Texas. I mean, did that bleed over into Phoenix? I mean, I know it.
I did it in Los Angeles, but Los Angeles for sure. Yeah, the Mexicans played. There's Mexican leagues back then of baseball. It was really big because the women was an offshoot of that. And they were sponsored by local businesses, and businesses would put their ads on billboards. It was a pretty big thing.
Well, if you go back to the 1940s, 1950s, they had what was it called? The California, Texas. No, let me back up. The Arizona, Texas, Mexico League. Okay, so you had teams in Mexico, you had teams in Arizona, teams in Texas, and it was one league, and all the teams played each other. So you would have teams like, say, from Oakland, California, going into Mexico to play a team from, say, Juarez or wherever the team was down in Mexico. It was very interesting, and a lot of that they had teams in Arizona in that league. So there has to be an imprint there around Phoenix on that kind of thing. But as long as there's been baseball in the Phoenix area. I can assure you of that. But yeah, that league involving I was just reading about it recently, involving Arizona and Texas and California. That was a hard scrabble league. From what I gather, the fields were hard cracked, and they played just in the heat. It was just tough, hard scrabble baseball, but it was viewed as kind of like a proving ground for young ball players to throw them out there. So,
Any other spots you can think of that are like Tampa, or is
oh
Tampa
yeah, certainly.
really a gem of
Key West,
itself?
Key West, the Key
Mm,
West. Right now, Key
mhm.
West High School to this day has the most high school baseball championships of any high school in the state of Florida. It's tied with, I think, Westminster High, a private school where Alex Rodriguez went to high school. They're in Miami, Fort Lauderdale area. But Key West had an incredible area for baseball for years because Key West was cigars in the same Latin culture that the Tampa ended up with. New York, of course, New Jersey, large contingent of Puerto Rico, the Dominican, coming into those areas. So there's many areas like that that had incredible Latino footprints with baseball. Certainly Texas, the Texas League, and the Mexican League.
Jen, I'm curious if you know of any sites related to the history that you were studying that are still in existence or, are preserved. Is there any kind of physical
Yeah, as
documentation do we
far
have
as
of
I
that?
know, no, they just played in ballparks, like whatever, like a park ballpark. So if that park is still there, probably yes. But they didn't play really the not the non-professional women. The professional women, they played in the stadiums that the men were not using. But for the most part, they just the local leagues just played at a local park. So as far as I know, I have no idea unless the park is still there at the specific ones in around the area, but I can always look. I'm from there. So that's what drew me to this is I'm from there. So
Yeah. And then Sayla just made a great point. Our executive director just made a great point in the chat about, researching the history of the cement companies and factories in a particular area. Because as you guys were both mentioning, of the baseball teams that would come out of the workplace like that.
Oh
Do we
yeah.
have any other questions from the group? And what were you saying, Dr. Sindari?
No, I was going to mention that the cultural diffusion that takes place amongst Latino players and white players, whether from the major leagues or from Latin America, it still takes place during the winter down in the Caribbean. I mean, I was reading about a young prospect for the Tampa Bay Rays who's played so well. He's playing on a team that Albert Pujols manages. They just won the Dominican World Series, but there's still a lot of young ball players who end up in those leagues during the winter. They have no experience with Latin American culture, who suddenly are down there and they're playing ball and they're getting caught up in that. Baseball has always done that. Okay, it's provided that avenue for cultural diffusion. As long as we have that avenue to expose the different cultures to the things that cultures can bring to each other, we don't build walls. We're tearing down walls, and that's what baseball does as much as anything. It's walls aren't just to hit baseball's over. Okay, walls can separate us, and we don't want that.
Yes, something that was very clear to me that you've always said, and that I really took to heart when I was at the Baseball Hall of Fame as an intern, again, coming at it from less of an interest in the sports history and more of an interest in the people and in the community, is that baseball history is American history. Every single major thing you can see line up in the history of the sport itself, and that just makes it so unique and interesting to find. I specifically studied, women's involvement in the sport and where they were at any particular period because I wanted to see how gender played a role. And it really is interesting just again thinking about the people who would come to the Hall of Fame very much as, a pilgrimage and how important it was to them. Do y'all know of any other, so Dr. Singletary, any other Latino baseball people in the Hall of Fame you want to talk about a little, maybe?
Oh, there's many
Yeah,
now.
too many,
So,
yeah.
yeah, no, Roberto Clemente, probably the best known of any, but there's so many now. I mean, but it's finally opened. Okay, it finally opened up, but there's just so many great Latinos in the Hall of Fame now that just too many to mention. But I mean, the greatest you would talk about, like I said, Martin de Higo, Roberto Clemente, and every year they go in now. Okay. So
I'm trying to find the link to the specific Latino baseball exhibit in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, which went in
all you have to
way,
do is watch a World Series.
yes,
Latinos dominate Major League Baseball now. I mean, they just dominate.
100%.
Okay. They
All right.
dominate.
Any
You
other
have
questions?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was
You
just gonna
have
see if any other questions.
okay.
Sorry. Jen, any other thoughts, comments you want to share?
No, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. This was fun.
I'm coming on audio. Could I ask a quick question? So
Please.
I'm curious, like, because the curiosity is why baseball? Like, why baseball in these communities? Like, I grew up playing in the Sandlot, but also soccer and a lot of different games. But baseball is really just, I don't know, it's just has this attraction to it. So, do y'all have any reasons from your research as to why it was?
Baseball used to be a poor boys game. Okay, it was a working class game. It's not anymore, and it's hard. Okay, little leagues are being torn apart by travel baseball. Old leagues like what I coach in, American Legion, that been around 100 years, are being ripped apart by travel baseball things. I mean, you have to kids spend thousands of dollars to play on these teams, and so kids are migrating to soccer, a game that a dozen kids can play on each side with one ball. But even that's getting expensive. But when you want to play ball, you can still play ball. A gang of kids can still take a bat and a baseball and go out to a field and figure it out. Okay. And baseball was always that way in poor communities. You didn't need much. A couple of bats, if they broke, you tacked them up. Okay. You can make gloves. I've seen Mario Rivera down in Panama showing kids how to make gloves out of paper plates. Okay. And you can still find a way to play the game. It was just always a game that you could play, and you didn't have to have a lot of money to do it. It's here, at least in this country, it seems to be getting away from that, but it's a game that brings people together, and it's just always been that way. It's a community game. This country, I guess football tends to reflect the nation now more days. What did George Will say? It's a game of violence interspersed with committee meetings. So baseball's not like that.
Also, my dad just shared a story with me recently, again, speaking to anyone's ability to play the game to a certain extent. If you want to share that, I just put in the chat about the sponge.
Oh yeah. No, I was talking to a friend of mine that played professional ball, but we were kids together, and he brought up, yeah, remember that sponge you used to put in your glove? And it's not like we had good gloves back then. We were a working class neighborhood. And I played with some good players, and I was a catcher, and I used to, but I knew how to catch, and I always caught the ball right in here. It was easier to get the ball out. But man, it would eat me up on this side of my hand. So I would just take one of my mother's kitchen gloves. She's like, "Where the sponges going?" One of her kitchen sponges, and I'd put it right up in here in the mitt because the padding would get worn out pretty quick. You're playing a lot of baseball when we were kids, and I'd stick them sponges up there, and you do whatever you can. When the glove starts to get worn out, you throw it in a bucket of water back then and hang it on the line and just let it get dry, and then work it with saddle soap and try to get some more life out of it. And that was good compared to the kids down on the islands. Like I said, down there playing baseball with paper plates. But look, baseball can be played. A pile of kids with a bat and a ball can get out and play a game, just like soccer can be played. How football can be played. They're all cheap if you want to get out of the house and do it. And at the right time, coming after the Civil War, coming after the War for Cuban liberation, you had a desire to get out and do things like that, and to be anti-colonial. Like they were in Cuba and in the other Latin American states, and they found something that was uniquely theirs, and they advanced with it. And I think they had as much to do with baseball spreading in this country as anything.
Jen, do you have anything to add about why baseball, or at least speaking to your own personal relationship
Yeah,
with the game?
it was, as he said, it was what they could afford. And when it was bigger, and when they were playing for the factory team, it was a factory team. It was something to do on Sunday. So if the factory team had a baseball team, or if it was just a bunch of guys that were getting together to play, then you went and played. If that's what was in your community, if you lived down the street from the park, then of course you're going to want to play baseball. So it was there, it was accessible, and so that's why it was the choice. For me personally, I grew up with Vin Scully's voice on the radio my entire life. It was always there. It was the background. until he passed. Like that to me was the voice of home. When I would hear it, when I was away listening to games, it's home. I went to a Dodger game, my first Dodger game. I was 5. We lost to the Mets. I still to this day hate the Mets. Just because 5-year-old me was very upset that day. So it's always been there. And so I think it's the same for the people that played back then. It was around. If your brother played, then you were a girl. Oh, maybe I want to play too. They have leagues for girls now. So it was just accessible, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the factories. Yeah, in West Tampa, Ybor City, they had what they called intersocial clubs. So you'd have Centro Asturiano for the Spaniards. You have the Ciclo Cubano. They had their own clubs, and they all had baseball teams. Okay, they had the Italian club, and they all had their own baseball teams in this intersocial league that would play against each other. And man, they would raid each other's teams, and guys were always jumping from one team to another. But man, they were so good, and they all played at Cascadia Park down in Ybor City. And you could talk to any of those old guys. At least when I was doing a lot of talking to them, so many of them have passed away now, but they had so many baseball stories. And fortunately, I grew up at a time like my stepfather played in a lot of that, and I was around a lot of it growing up. I mean, I loved baseball, and all the older guys around me got a kick out of it, and they were always telling me about their time. And baseball is something that can be handed down if kids are into it. And where I grew up in Tampa, baseball was our thing. It's a very democratic game. I mean, you could be rich and the other kid can be poor, but you get on the ball field, the best player's going to fail 7 times out of 10 at the plate. So it's a very democratic game.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up. I think that's a great way to end, unless there are any other questions. Renee, if you want to come in and send us off.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming in, waiting for my video. Oh, here we go. Yeah, thank you all so much for a wonderful presentation. I definitely learned a lot. I know the folks in watching live and the chat, thank you so much for putting in your comments and questions. Thank you for making that engaging. And once again, this presentation was recorded. So it will be published on our website in 7 days. Thank you all so much for joining. Bye.
My pleasure.
Awesome.